Good afternoon to our viewers here in Denmark, and especially good afternoon to our dear friend and guiding light, Ivan Krastev in Albania. Thank you so much for being with us, Ivan.
Thank you very much. And really, the weather in Albania is so good and the light is so strong that I can guide anybody.
Thank you. I want to ask you first, Ivan, because we had this very interesting sequence this week that both has something to do with Europe, with the pandemic, and with the economic order of the societies we're living in, where we had these oligarchs announcing a new super football league Sunday night. And my son, who's a football fan like me, he said to me, "Okay, Dad, you'll be socialist moaning like you always do, and we'll have 24 hours of saying this is too bad, evil capitalism, and then we'll just watch the football in half a year." And we've gotten used to it. This is how it usually goes. They say, "Oh no, the Arabs can't buy Man City. They can't, the Russians can't buy Chelsea." But this time something completely different happened, and the oligarchs fell. How should we understand this event?
So I do believe it's very important. It is very symptomatic because, okay, you have these oligarchs, and for them, football is business, celebrity, but business too. And the idea is how to recover the money that they lost for this 1 year. And then they realize that certain things are not possible anymore because societies are becoming much more sensitive. You cannot simply build a kind of a rich football club's ghetto in the moment when everybody is suffering. And I do believe what has happened is simply they understood that they're going to pay a price. And particularly strong this was in, of course, in England, where society really paid a very high price, where people are just starting to recover, where for many people, football is their life, not simply their hobby. And all these people understood that it's not going to work this. And I do believe it's a very symptomatic for many things. It cannot be business as usual. The moment the businesses believe that they can do everything that is going to give them profit, they're risking a lot.
So do you think that I think it's very difficult to see what kind of moment that we're in. To a certain extent, you see citizens, at least here in Denmark, they're just longing for the old normal. They want to get back to how things were. On the other hand, you see really new things happen politically. Do you think we're at a moment that is still politically open, where, for instance, this neoliberal order that we've gotten used to is being challenged fundamentally?
I do believe it's going to be a change, much more of a change than we have after 9/11 or after the global financial crisis, because also there was a kind of a changes accumulated there. One of the things is that, of course, different things different people had a different 1 year. And this is quite important to see that it depends in the country in which you are. It depends basically how you spend this 1 year, basically how you can afford this and that. But we're going to see something strange, which happens in history. Nostalgia is going to bring radical change. The moment when people want it to be how it used to be, they're going to understand that it is not possible anymore. Because even if we're going to normalize some of the travel in Europe, for example, in several months, we're not going to normalize easily travel in the world. Then suddenly, basically, people are not going to agree that the normal laws that 70%, for example, of all vaccines are produced in one country, basically India. So from this point of view, there are going to be changes, and the changes is also happening because this is one of the crises that affected every single person in the world. It was not true for the global financial crisis.
When I spoke to you half a year ago, we just had this new European budget, and we have this great recovery act. And we were talking about this could be a new moment for Europe, that Europe, instead of being austerity, that they could be generating growth and really helping people. And you saw Germany abandoning their Schwarze Null. Now, half a year later, it seems that there's going to be huge growth in America. And we see the first quarter in China, they're rising dramatically, and it seems now that Europe is lagging behind. How do you see the financial situation in Europe at the moment, and the prospects?
No, this is very important, and I believe probably we have touched on this even in our previous discussion. One of the important things that happened for this 1 year is that we're living in a dictatorship, and this is the dictatorship of comparisons. Every single day, basically, people are comparing what is happening in their countries, what is happening in other parts of the world. The comparison looked very easy when we have been just comparing the number of people infected, the number of people dying, now the number of people vaccinating. But now we start to compare the economic recovery. And here is the story. In a certain way, Europe made a major breakthrough institutionally. Certain money have been committed, but Europe is a very low risk political player, unfortunately. If you see the size of the stimulus that the Americans put and compare with Europe, basically trying to see how they're compensating for the decline of the output for this 1 year, it's a 3-to-1. Yes. In a certain way, basically, Biden betted everything. He basically decided that this is either going to save the economy or destroy the economy, but this is a moment like this. While in Europe, I do believe we have a very low risk culture. And this is something that can turn to be a huge issue, because imagine that in September or October, we are going to have a new lockdowns in places like Germany, for example. This is going to trigger a different political crisis of a totally different nature. Because people are expecting something to happen. And you can see, for example, the Brits and the Americans, they send a message to their population. Listen, just try to see how many people I'm going to vaccinate. As if everything else doesn't matter. Europeans, unfortunately, for many reasons, which we can discuss, didn't send a message like this. And as a result of it, in many places, you can see that people are getting impatient, people are getting angry, and they're not angry simply with this or that policy. They have the feeling that we're getting something wrong. And I was reading the latest opinion polls in Germany. Listen, Greens 4 or 5 points ahead of CDU-CSU. Just 6 months after CDU-CSU was at 40, it shows you the level of volatility in the continent.
Is there also an institutional problem here? Because we don't have, I mean, you're absolutely right, we're more cautious and low risk than Americans, but we don't have the same capacity for political action that they do in China.
Totally.
Or that they do in...
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. And in a certain way, this was the tragedy of the von der Leyen, because I do believe she rightly decided to use this crisis basically to show that European Union can work. Yes. And the Commission took the lead on the vaccines, and she was well prepared because she has the medical practice and education. So this is not the area of public health that is unknown to her. But several things happened. If you try to compare, for example, take the Brits or the Israelis on one side. I'm going to take the Israelis, which of course took the highest risks of them all. And take the European Union. When we start to negotiate with the companies or the Americans, for the European negotiators, because of the nature of the union, first, you should try to get a very good price, because otherwise the member states are going to blame you that you're buying too expensive and why you're doing this, how we're going to explain to our voters. Secondly, it should be very transparent, because basically how, as somebody very nicely said, European bureaucrats much more fear auditors than voters. And thirdly, you should keep all these balances. The French vaccines, the German vaccines, and so on, everything should be. On the other side, for example, you have the Israelis who overpaid 40% on Pfizer compared with Europe, but they said we're going to give you all the data from our vaccination, which is incredibly important for the big pharma. But what we wanted quickly. We want to be your priority. And they have a good reasons for this. One was the elections, for sure, and Netanyahu was betting on this. But the second thing that many people miss is that because around 12-15% of the population of Israel is highly religious people who are not ready to obey the lockdown. If you are not going to be very quick recovering after this crisis, you're going to create a major social crisis. So why I'm saying this, European Union, you're right, does not have the capacity to work like this, because European Union cannot declare an extraordinary situation for the continent. In a certain way, this is the old Carl Schmittian problem, that the sovereign is the one who can decide on the state of exception. And from this point of view, the European Union does not have the capacity of a sovereign. And this is why we ended up in a situation in which we have less vaccines that we should And keeping in mind that European Union is a very big market, obviously we were well positioned if we were ready to risk to do it. But secondly, and I do believe many people are underestimating this, when one country decides to be overcautious, it hurts everybody else. With AstraZeneca, it was clear. For example, nevertheless, the European agency is saying it's fine. When one country said it's not fine, everybody says, no, 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 we should also say it's not fine, because otherwise our people are going to believe that we're treating them worse than the Danes or than the Germans. And this is a very, very big problem for the European Union. And I do believe we're going to see the result of this problem. Second, the European Union really lost a lot out of its position. We're talking about vaccine diplomacy. There is no European vaccine diplomacy. We allowed 50% of the vaccines produced in Europe to get out, which is fine, but don't believe that anybody sees these vaccines as donated to the world. When the Russians or the Chinese send their vaccines, their ambassador is waiting on the airport with the prime minister, and all of them basically are crying together. Basically, nobody is crying with the European vaccines because it's simply companies selling to other governments.
So do you think that it's obvious, I think, that from what you're saying, that when it comes to vaccinations, we have institutional rules and exactly like you're saying, that we don't have the tolerance of a state that is acting against the rules and states of exception. Do you think this really displays to the European citizens that we need some kind of reform? I mean, just about 1 year ago, it was like, we can do new things, we can make a huge budget, we can make green transformation, we can protect the digital technologies of Europe, we can make European champions. At that point, it was like the European Union is stronger than I'd seen it before. Now it seems that the gap between what is expected from the Union and what it politically and institutionally is capable of delivering is growing at a time when people are really looking for political help. Do you think this?
Totally. And by the way, this is a major change, because you need a really radical institutional changes in order to respond to this. Just give you one example. Americans basically responded to the crisis in a militarized way. It's not by accident that you have a military people that have been put in charge. So they have been bringing capacities, new production sites, and so on, the way you react in the moment of war. Europe cannot do this, because in a certain way, paradoxically, von der Leyen is buying the vaccines, but she does not own the vaccines. And one of the reasons why the member states was so happy to allow the European Commission to do it is because the liability goes to the European agency, particularly for poor countries. Like Bulgaria, the major story is, if this vaccine is going wrong and if people start suing us, who is going to pay? And I do believe this is a very important moment, because the world is moving to a much more activist state. And on one level, of course, European Commission is not a classical government. They're much more constrained in what they can do. On the other side, because of the European Union, even the national governments are much more constrained. Because basically, as we saw, you can close your borders for a while and you can do this and that. But otherwise, if you're going just to have a policy on your own, if everybody starts basically to license their own vaccines without waiting for the common European policy, this is also going to create tensions in the Union. And as a result of it, I do believe we entered a very bad situation in which many national governments, in order to prove to their citizens that they care about them, started to break the European rules. Breaking the European rules became a kind of, listen, I so much care about you that, for example, I'm going to buy a vaccine that is not licensed.
This was definitely also the case here in Denmark. You know, our prime minister going to Israel to show, well, this is such an extraordinary situation. So I must show, I don't care that he's a right-wing corrupt leader on Sebastian Kurz. She's a left-wing social democrat. But you went with him because this was an alliance that suspended all other ideologies and principles. I think this was the case here as well.
Totally. Listen, this is the symbolic politics. And basically, this is also what Kurz did and what the 6 Central and East Europeans who went with Kurz to Vienna. Because the story is, you try to send one message to your own people. I'm going really to do the impossible for you. And as a result of it, this is why you are breaking the rules to say, even the European rules are not going to constrain me. But listen, when everybody starts breaking the rules, then the union also starts to have a problem. In your case, you didn't break the rules. It was symbolic politics. But when you basically start buying vaccines and others, you create the following problem. If you're going to get some of the Chinese vaccines that have not been even applying for license with the European Union, other people who are going to be vaccinated with them going to be allowed to travel freely?
Do you think there was also this, we talked about this in the fall, that there was this geopolitical ambition in the new commission, that Ursula von der Leyen was very explicit about how the European Union would be a geopolitical player and how strategic autonomy would be an ambition for them. And that was at a point where America was weak. And the European Union, they made their own investment, or the Commission made their own investment agreement with China. And the Americans were furious about it. And it was like the European Commission was showing, well, we're not depending on you anymore. We're making our own policies with China. Do you think they made a kind of a geopolitical overreach? They overestimated their own capacity and they underestimated Americans?
No, listen, in a certain way, they were also in a difficult position. I do believe from time to time, being fair is not the worst thing that we can do. Of course, the European, if you're a European political leader, in the moment of a growing geopolitical polarization, particularly between the United States and China, you try to keep a much more cooperative world because Europe is very much depending on this. Because many people talk about the Cold War, but for many Europeans, I mean West Europeans, we're not talking the East, Cold War was also the moment of a limited sovereignty because you are really very much dependent. So in a certain way, I do believe European Union decided to say, if we're going to take the initiative, if we're going to do certain things with the Chinese, with the Americans, we can reduce the tensions. It didn't work. I don't believe that von der Leyen should be blamed for this. But then the European Union did something which I found wrong. When you see that the world is going polarized, trying to pretend that you not notice it, put you in an idiotic position. So you go to Moscow in order to be humiliated in the case of Borrell. You go to Turkey and you're put on the sofa. So from this point of view, in a certain way, for a while, we have been trying to defend the status quo that does not exist anymore. And this is a very kind of unfortunate position.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right that it's easy for me to laugh at von der Leyen 4 months ago, because this has been for a year an absolutely open political situation, and we haven't been able to predict for the next 3 or 6 months. And at the time, I totally agreed with her.
Absolutely.
Making I mean, we couldn't wait for the Americans. And I think Merkel was originally right when she said we must start thinking about how we could defend ourselves. So I think that was the right ambition. But I think it puts Europe at an awkward place now between China and the US. How do you see Europe? How should Europe, in your view, position itself now at this very interesting situation with the America and China being adversaries, competitors, and rivals at the same time?
I don't believe it's going to be extremely difficult. Of course, it's not going to be the classical Cold War. We're not back to the 1940s for very simple reasons that we're living in a much more interdependent world. But from this point of view, for Europe, it's even more difficult. Because in a certain way, when the Soviets and the Americans clashed in the 1940s, there was not many American goods going to Soviet Union, and basically there was no Soviet goods going to the West. And now it's different. And as a result of it, I do believe that the first thing that Europe, unfortunately, is going to lose is that if we're going to see decoupling in the technological sphere, they're not going to be European technological sphere. Obviously, we're going to be part of the American technological sphere because we're not going to recreate Google and Facebook in the next 2 or 3 months. But when this happens, this is the idea of Europe that we're going to regulate a common technological space, and that we are in a strong position exactly because we don't have Alibaba and we don't have Google. This does not work anymore. On climate, I do believe that European Union is trying to do its best to push for a much more cooperative agenda, because decoupling on climate, nevertheless, of what we're going to do if others are doing nothing, nothing will change. But also what I'm very much afraid of, and this is, I do believe, development for the last 2 months, that probably very few in Europe expected to escalate so quickly. I do believe we're seeing a much more coordination in aggressive provocations on the side of both Russia and China when it comes to Ukraine and Taiwan. If you see from outside, you're going to see the coordinating timing of Chinese flights basically violating the sovereignty of Taiwan, all these kind of thousands and thousands of troops on the Ukrainian border. And in a situation like this, Europe does not have much of a choice, because when it comes to hard power, the truth is that Europe did not invest enough. And that basically we're very much in places like Ukraine and others, depending much more on the NATO and the Americans than on our own. And I do believe this is a situation which is very much going to constrain the choices of European leaders. And it's not only on the level of the European Union. I do believe that Chancellor Merkel now is in a much, much more difficult position than she was even 3 or 4 months ago.
So do you think there, I mean, it makes sense. I thought that it was very difficult for the new American President Biden to say Taiwan or Ukraine. I mean, where to focus his interest, trying to withdraw from it. But I didn't think that it was coordinated between the two countries.
This is my feeling. And listen, I'm following Russia, of course, much more close than China. But one of the effects of this geopolitical polarization was that both countries obviously starting talking much more to each other. And of course, their interests does not coincide on everything. But I do believe that President Trump's calculation that he can basically take the Russians on the American side was a flawed thinking anyway. And from this point of view now, President Biden is in a very difficult position, because on one level, the structural nature of the Chinese-American confrontation makes it very difficult for him to change this. And I do believe that he's really worried about what he sees happening in China. On the other side, President Putin is extremely hostile to the Democrats. For many reasons. He basically knew what he did to them. So probably he can expect what they want to do to him. But the result of it is that you have this kind of a huge escalation on the level of sentiments and on the level of sanctions on economic policies. And here is the story. For the first time, I do believe we're in a situation in which the fear is that with the world preoccupied with COVID-19, inward-looking government, politicians not physically meeting each other. In the way people get slightly kind of freaking out after this 1 year confined, politicians are also people. I know that many people will not agree, but politicians are also people, and they're also freaking out. And the situation can get out of the control, not because one or the other side particularly have an ambition to do this and that, but because the levels of mistrust between the West and the Chinese, the West and the Russians, and to a certain extent, even between the Europeans and Americans on a certain level, is very, very high.
I think that's a very interesting and very real point, that, you know, it takes the level down on all hostilities if you meet in person. It just
totally
basically, and if you imagine they're being isolated and they're just getting from their intelligence and a bit from the media and from experts, then of course that accelerates hostilities and suspicions. How I think it's very, very difficult for Europe how it should position itself towards Russia at the moment. I mean, these sanctions, what are they? Normally, when you put in sanctions, you show people who are acting, we're not accepting this. And then the whole deal is how to get rid of these bloody sanctions afterwards, when they have it. So it's like you do something, you know it won't achieve your goal. You must do something. If you do that, how do you ever get rid of the sanctions again?
No, listen, for me, the biggest problem is that in the case of the sanctions normally should be an instrument of a policy. They are not the policy. So in a certain way, you put the sanctions because you expect this or this to happen as a result of it. In the last 5 years, we basically recognized that sanctions, probably with the exception of the most nuclear options on them, are not going to change Russia's foreign policy. On the other side, we cannot accept things that Russians are doing, be it with Navalny, be it what is happening with troops in Ukraine. So as a result of it, we start to put sanctions in the way you're putting a press release. This is one more way to say how unhappy we are.
Yes, exactly.
But this is inflating the sanctions. Listen, sanctions is a very important instrument. It cannot be used simply for symbolic politics. And then now you have, as a result of it, a situation in which we had a famous Bulgarian writer who used to say, every scandal in Bulgaria is just for 3 days, but every 3 days we have a scandal. So something like this is happening in the international politics. You see what is happening with the Czech diplomats, and basically, yes. And I do believe we go in an escalation, which is not because of any of the sides have a clear idea what they're going to gain strategically. But this is just mirroring. And this could be very, very dangerous, because in a way it's an escalation for the escalation's sake.
I have one last question for you, because you have a meeting in 4 or 5 minutes, and so we end it quickly today. But we're just so glad that you want to talk to us again and take the time. I think I have the feeling that in some of the old communist countries there is more fear towards Russia than before. That if you look at the reactions in the Czech Republic or the reactions in Poland, that tension is rising there. But I might be totally wrong.
No, you're not totally wrong. And of course, it's different from country to country. But listen, Czech Republic was one of the Russia-friendly countries in general. If you basically look, the Czech president was one of the most pro-Russian politicians. And then you have a very aggressive intelligence intervention that cost the life of the 2 Czech citizens. So from this point of view, I do believe that in a certain way, there was a certain balance in policies. It's one thing to disinform and to attack you informationally. It's totally different thing basically to create an explosion in your arms stores. And this is creating a tension, because particularly for governments that try to be very cooperative with the Russians, now they should show to their own populations that they're not in the pocket of the Russians. So now they should overreact.
Yes. Well, I don't want to overreact, but I just want to thank you for taking your time yet again and helping us understand this very open and very interesting, but also a little scary situation that we have with the COVID-19. Thank you so much, Ivan Krastev.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
Ciao.
Ciao.